Sarah Mitchell stood at attention in the military training ground, her uniform crisp and her posture perfect. The morning sun beat down on the recruits as they awaited inspection. She had dreamed of this moment for years, joining the military just like her father and grandfather before her. But nothing could have prepared her for Colonel Marcus Henderson. The colonel walked down the line of recruits, his boots creating sharp sounds against the concrete. He was a tall man with gray hair and a face that seemed permanently set in a scowl. When he reached Sarah, he stopped and looked her up and down with clear disdain in his eyes. "So you think you can make it in my military?" Colonel Henderson said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Look at you. Barely 5'4". What are you going to do when the real challenges come?" "Hide behind the men." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her eyes forward. She refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. The other recruits shifted uncomfortably, some glancing at her with sympathy. "I asked you a question, recruit," the colonel barked. "No, sir. I will face every challenge head-on, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation she felt. The colonel laughed, a harsh sound that made several recruits flinch. "We'll see about that. In my 30 years of service, I've seen hundreds like you come and go. Women who think they can handle what real soldiers do? Most of them quit within the first month." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper that only Sarah could hear. "Save yourself the embarrassment, Mitchell. Go home. This isn't a place for little girls playing dress-up." Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides, but she maintained her composure. "Permission to speak, sir?" "Denied," the colonel snapped, moving on to the next recruit. That night in the barracks, Sarah lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The other female recruits gathered around her bed, offering words of encouragement. Maria, a fellow recruit who had become her friend, sat beside her. "Don't let him get to you," Maria said softly. "Henderson is known for being tough on everyone, but especially on women. He doesn't think we belong here." "I know," Sarah replied, her jaw set with determination, "but I'm not leaving. I don't care what he thinks. I'm going to prove him wrong." The weeks that followed were brutal. Colonel Henderson seemed to make it his personal mission to break Sarah. During physical training, he would assign her extra laps. During drills, he would criticize every small mistake she made while overlooking the same errors in male recruits. During weapons training, he would make sarcastic comments about her shooting stance. "Gosh, Mitchell, my grandmother could load that rifle faster than you, and she's been dead for 10 years, he would say, causing other instructors to laugh, but Sarah never complained. She never cried in front of him, though she shed tears alone in the shower some nights. Instead, she trained harder. She woke up an hour before everyone else to run extra miles. She practiced her rifle assembly until she could do it blindfolded. She studied military strategy books late into the night when others were sleeping. One afternoon, during an obstacle course exercise, Sarah slipped on a muddy rope climb and fell hard onto the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs. As she struggled to catch her breath, Colonel Henderson appeared above her, getting tired already, Mitchell. It's only been 2 hours. Real soldiers can go for days without rest. But I suppose you're not a real soldier, are you? Sarah pulled herself up, ignoring the pain shooting through her back. No, sir. I mean, yes, sir. I am a soldier, sir. Then act like one and complete the course, he snapped. Or quit. Nobody would blame you. Sarah completed the course, even though every muscle in her body screamed in protest. She finished last among the recruits that day, but she finished. Colonel Henderson just shook his head as if her effort was pathetic. The mockery continued for months. During classroom sessions on military tactics, he would call on Sarah with the most difficult questions, hoping to embarrass her in front of the class. When she answered correctly, he would dismiss her response as book-smart but not combat-ready. During a field exercise, Sarah's team was tasked with navigating through difficult terrain to reach a checkpoint. She took the lead, using the map-reading skills she had worked hard to develop. Her team reached the checkpoint first, beating several male-led teams. Colonel Henderson arrived at the checkpoint and looked at the results board. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see if you can do it again." Sarah's fellow soldiers began to notice the unfair treatment. Some of the male recruits started speaking up in her defense, but Sarah always told them to stop. She didn't want their pity or their help. She wanted to succeed on her own terms. Lieutenant James Parker, a younger officer who worked under Colonel Henderson, approached Sarah one evening. "I've been watching how he treats you," he said quietly. "It's not right. I could speak to the commanding officer about it." "No, thank you, sir," Sarah said firmly. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to handle this my way. If I run to someone for help every time things get difficult, then maybe the colonel is right about me." Lieutenant Parker nodded with respect in his eyes. "You're stronger than most soldiers I've trained with. Don't let him make you think otherwise." As the training program progressed, Sarah continued to excel despite the constant mockery. She scored in the top 10% on her marksmanship tests. She led her team to victory in multiple tactical exercises. She earned her first aid certification with perfect scores. But none of it seemed to matter to Colonel Henderson. During a particularly harsh winter training exercise, the recruits were sent into the woods for 3 days with minimal supplies. Sarah's group faced unexpected heavy snowfall that made conditions dangerous. When one of her fellow soldiers twisted his ankle badly, Sarah fashioned a splint from branches and helped carry him back to camp, adding several miles to their journey. Colonel Henderson was at the base camp when they arrived. He looked at the injured soldier, then at Sarah, her face red from exertion and cold. "Mitchell, did you carry this soldier back?" he asked. "We took turns, sir." "But yes, I helped carry him," Sarah replied. "Real soldiers don't need to be carried. They push through," the colonel said coldly. "By helping him, you made him weak. That's the problem with women in the military. You turn everyone soft." The injured soldier tried to protest, saying Sarah had potentially saved his life. But Colonel Henderson cut him off and walked away. Sarah stood there in the snow, watching the colonel's back as he retreated. For the first time, she didn't feel hurt or angry. She felt something else entirely. She felt sorry for him. Sorry that he was so trapped in his old beliefs, that he couldn't see the truth right in front of him. She made a silent promise to herself that night. No matter how long it took, no matter how much harder she had to work, she would prove that women belonged in the military. She would become the best soldier the colonel had ever seen. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, the months of training were coming to an end, and graduation was approaching. Sarah had survived everything Colonel Henderson had thrown at her. But neither of them knew that their story was far from over. The future had plans that would change everything between them. 5 years had passed since Sarah Mitchell graduated from basic training. Despite Colonel Henderson's constant discouragement, she had finished in the top 5% of her class. The ceremony had been bittersweet. While her family cheered and her fellow soldiers congratulated her, the colonel had handed her the graduation certificate without a word, his face showing nothing but disapproval. Sarah was now a sergeant, stationed at a forward operating base in a conflict zone overseas. The dusty compound was surrounded by high walls and guard towers, a small piece of order in a chaotic region. She had proven herself time and again in real combat situations. Earning the respect of her fellow soldiers and superiors alike, her days were filled with coordinating supply lines, training new soldiers, and leading missions into dangerous territory. She had saved lives, made tough decisions under fire, and shown the kind of courage that earned medals. Her chest now bore several ribbons, including a bronze star for valor in combat. But Colonel Henderson's words still echoed in her mind sometimes, especially during quiet moments. She had carried his mockery with her like unwanted baggage for years. Every achievement felt like it had to be twice as good to prove his judgment wrong. Every challenge felt like a test she couldn't afford to fail. "You're thinking about him again, aren't you?" Captain David Chen, her friend and fellow officer, said one evening, as they shared coffee in the mess hall. Sarah looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "You get this determined look on your face like you're fighting an invisible enemy," David said with a kind smile. "You've mentioned the colonel before? 5 years later, and you're still trying to prove something to a man who probably doesn't even remember your name." "He remembers," Sarah said quietly. "Men like that always remember the people they tried to break." "Maybe," David replied. but you're not broken. Look at what you've accomplished. You're one of the best sergeants in this unit. The soldiers under your command would follow you anywhere. When are you going to stop letting his opinion matter? Sarah knew David was right, but letting go was harder than it seemed. Colonel Henderson had become a symbol in her mind, representing every person who had ever doubted her, every obstacle she had to work twice as hard to overcome. Weeks later, Sarah received news that changed her trajectory. She had been selected for Officer Candidate School, a prestigious program that would train her to become a commissioned officer. It was an honor that only a small percentage of enlisted soldiers achieved. The selection board had reviewed her record and found it exemplary. The night before she left for Officer Candidate School, her unit threw her a small party. Soldiers she had served with lined up to shake her hand and wish her well. Some of them, tough men who rarely showed emotion, had tears in their eyes. "You're going to be the best officer the Army has ever seen," said Private Johnson, a young soldier Sarah had mentored. "You taught me what real leadership looks like. Not the kind that yells and threatens, but the kind that inspires people to be better." Officer Candidate School was intense. Sarah found herself among the best and brightest soldiers from across the military. The coursework was demanding, covering everything from advanced military strategy to international law. The physical training was grueling, designed to push candidates to their absolute limits, but Sarah thrived. After years of proving herself under the harshest criticism, challenges of Officer Candidate School felt almost manageable. She studied late into the night, helped her fellow candidates when they struggled, and led by example during every exercise. One of her instructors, Major Patricia Williams, took notice of her exceptional performance. Major Williams was a decorated officer with 20 years of service and a reputation for being fair but demanding. "Sergeant Mitchell, I've been reviewing your file," Major Williams said during a private meeting. "Your record is impressive, but there's something else I notice. You push yourself harder than anyone else here. It's admirable, but I sense you're running from something rather than towards something. May I ask why?" Sarah hesitated, then decided honesty was the best approach. She told Major Williams about Colonel Henderson, about the years of mockery and doubt, about the weight she had carried trying to prove him wrong. Major Williams listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. When Sarah finished, the major leaned back in her chair and sighed. "I had a Colonel Henderson in my life too," she said softly. "A commanding officer who told me I would never make it past captain because women weren't cut out for strategic thinking. It took me years to realize something important. I wasn't succeeding to prove him wrong. I was succeeding because I was good at what I did. Once I understood that difference, everything changed." "What happened to him?" Sarah asked. "He retired as a colonel, convinced until his last day that he was right about women in the military. Some people never change their minds, Sergeant, but that's their limitation, not yours. The question is, when will you stop letting his limitation become your burden?" The conversation stayed with Sarah. She began to understand that her success had never been about Colonel Henderson. It had always been about her own strength, determination, and capability. She had been an excellent soldier, despite his mockery, not because of it. Months passed, and Sarah graduated from Officer Candidate School with honors. She was now Second Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell. Her family attended the commissioning ceremony, beaming with pride as she took her oath as an officer. Her mother cried happy tears, and her father, a retired Army sergeant himself, saluted her with obvious emotion. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," her father said, his voice thick. "You've accomplished something remarkable, Sarah, not just becoming an officer, but doing it with grace and integrity." Sarah's first assignment as an officer was to a base stateside, where she would serve as a platoon leader. She was responsible for 40 soldiers, their training, welfare, and readiness. It was a huge responsibility, but she was ready for it. Under her leadership, her platoon excelled. She treated her soldiers with respect while maintaining high standards. She listened to their concerns and advocated for their needs. When they made mistakes, she corrected them firmly but fairly. When they succeeded, she celebrated their achievements. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, was impressed. You have a natural gift for leadership, Lieutenant Mitchell. Your soldiers respect you, and more importantly, they trust you. That's rare, especially for a new officer. As months turned into years, Sarah continued to rise through the ranks. She became a first lieutenant, then a captain. Each promotion came with new challenges and responsibilities. But she met them all with the same determination. She had shown as a recruit. She led her company through a difficult deployment to a war zone, making decisions that saved lives and accomplished critical missions. She earned another medal for her actions during an ambush where her quick thinking prevented casualties among her soldiers. She became known throughout her division as an officer who led from the front and never asked her soldiers to do anything she wouldn't do. Herself, Captain Chen, who had been promoted to major, crossed paths with her again at a training conference. Over dinner, they caught up on their careers and lives. "Do you still think about Colonel Henderson?" he asked, with a gentle smile. Sarah paused, considering the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not the way I used to. I don't feel like I need to prove anything to him anymore. If I think about him now, it's more with sadness than anger. He missed out on seeing some truly great soldiers simply because of his prejudices." "That's growth," Major Chen said approvingly. "You've become the leader you were always meant to be, Sarah. Not in spite of what he said, but independent of it." Years continued to pass. Sarah became a major herself, then a lieutenant colonel. She commanded a battalion, responsible for hundreds of soldiers. She served in multiple combat zones, earning a reputation as a brilliant tactician and compassionate leader. Officers who served under her went on to successful careers, often citing her as their most influential mentor. During one deployment, Sarah faced one of her toughest challenges. Her battalion was tasked with securing a hostile area where insurgents had been conducting attacks. Intelligence was limited, and the risk was high. Sarah spent days analyzing the situation, consulting with her staff, and developing a plan that would accomplish the mission while minimizing danger to her soldiers. The operation was successful. With no friendly casualties and the objective secured, her commanding general personally commended her for the mission's planning and execution. It was the kind of success that would be noted in her official record and considered during future promotion boards. As Sarah sat in her office that night, paperwork spread across her desk. She thought about her journey, from that humiliated recruit standing in formation while a colonel mocked her, to a successful lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion in combat. She had come so far, overcome so much, but what Sarah didn't know was that her path was about to cross with Colonel Henderson once more. The military, despite being vast, had a way of bringing people together at unexpected moments. And when that moment came, neither of them would be the same people they had been all those years ago on that training ground. The future was approaching fast, carrying with it a confrontation that had been years in the making. Sarah had grown and evolved, but had Colonel Henderson? Only time would tell. * Lieutenant Colonel Sarah. Mitchell arrived at Fort Harrison for a new assignment as the executive officer of a brigade. At 40 years old, she had spent nearly 2 decades in the military, building a reputation as one of the most capable officers in her field. Her uniform now displayed an impressive array of ribbons and badges, each one representing a challenge overcome or a mission accomplished. The brigade headquarters was a large, modern building at the center of the base. Sarah walked through the corridors with confidence, greeting soldiers who saluted as she passed. She was scheduled to meet with her new commanding officer that afternoon, and she wanted to familiarize herself with the facility first. As she turned a corner near the command offices, she nearly collided with an older officer carrying a stack of files. Papers scattered across the floor, and both officers bent down to gather them. "My apologies. I should have been watching where I was going," Sarah said, reaching for the documents. "It was my fault entirely," a familiar voice replied. Sarah's hand froze, mid-reach. She looked up slowly and found herself staring into a face she hadn't seen in person for 15 years. Colonel Marcus Henderson looked back at her, his expression one of polite apology that quickly shifted to confusion, then recognition. The years had changed him. His hair was completely white now, and deep lines etched his face. He looked older, more tired than she remembered. But those eyes were the same, the ones that had looked at her with such disdain all those years ago. Mitchell, he said, uncertainty in his voice as he glanced at her rank insignia. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. Yes, sir, Sarah replied, standing and handing him the papers she had collected. Her voice was steady, professional, giving away none of the surprise churning inside her. Henderson stood as well, his gaze moving from her face to her uniform. Taking in the lieutenant colonel rank, the rows of ribbons, the combat badges, his mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to say something. But no words came out. An awkward silence stretched between them in the empty corridor. Finally, Henderson cleared his throat. See, you've made quite a career for yourself, he said stiffly. Congratulations on your success, Lieutenant Colonel. Thank you, sir, Sarah replied. If you'll excuse me, I have an appointment with my new commanding officer. She moved to walk past him, but Henderson spoke again. Your commanding officer. That would be Brigadier General Thompson, correct? Yes, sir. Henderson nodded slowly, something unreadable crossing his face. Well, I'm sure you'll do well here. Sarah nodded politely and continued down the corridor, feeling Henderson's gaze on her back as she walked away. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her stride steady and professional. After all these years, all the growth and accomplishments, seeing him still triggered memories she thought she had long since processed. The meeting with Brigadier General Thompson went well. The general was a sharp, no-nonsense officer with an impressive record. She outlined Sarah's responsibilities and expectations, and seemed pleased with Sarah's experience and qualifications. You'll be working closely with several senior officers on my staff, General Thompson explained, including Colonel Henderson, my senior advisor. I believe you may have crossed paths with him earlier? Sarah kept her face neutral. Yes, ma'am. Briefly in the corridor. Good. Colonel Henderson has been with this brigade for 3 years. He's an experienced officer, though he's set to retire in about 8 months. I value his institutional knowledge, even if his views can be a bit traditional at times. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled into her new role. Her responsibilities were extensive, coordinating between different battalions, overseeing training programs, and advising the general on operational matters. She worked long hours, but the challenge energized her. Working in the same headquarters as Colonel Henderson proved awkward at first. They would pass each other in corridors, attend the same briefings, and sit in the same staff meetings. Henderson was always formally polite, but Sarah could sense his discomfort. He rarely spoke directly to her unless required by duty, and when he did, his tone was carefully neutral. During a staff meeting about upcoming training exercises, Sarah presented a detailed plan she had developed for improving combat readiness. She spoke confidently, backing up her proposals with data and strategic analysis. When she finished, General Thompson nodded approvingly. Excellent work, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. Does anyone have concerns or suggestions? The general asked, looking around the table. Colonel Henderson shifted in his seat but said nothing. Sarah noticed several junior officers glancing between her and the colonel, clearly aware of some tension, even if they didn't understand its source. One evening, Sarah was working late in her office when she heard a knock on the door. She looked up to find Colonel Henderson standing in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. Colonel Henderson, Sarah said, standing. What can I do for you, sir? May I come in? He asked. I'd like to speak with you privately if you have a moment.
Nice.
Sarah gestured to a chair, curiosity overcoming her surprise. Henderson entered and closed the door behind him, then sat down heavily. He seemed to struggle with how to begin. I owe you an apology, he finally said, his voice quiet. For how I treated you during your basic training, it was unprofessional and unfair. Sarah sat back in her chair, studying him carefully. This was unexpected. What brought about this change of heart, sir? Henderson sighed, looking down at his hands. Honestly, seeing your record. When I realized you were assigned here, I requested your personnel file. I read about your deployments, your awards, the commendations from your commanding officers. You've had an exceptional career by any standard. Thank you, sir, but that doesn't fully answer my question. My record has been public information for years. Why apologize now? The colonel was quiet for a moment, then looked up at her with something like shame in his eyes. Because seeing you here as a lieutenant colonel forced me to confront something I've been avoiding for a long time. I was wrong about you. Completely wrong. And if I was wrong about you, then I have to consider how many others I was wrong about. Sarah listened without interrupting, letting him continue. I spent 35 years in the military, Henderson said. I came up in a different era, when women in the service were rare and usually kept away from combat roles. I convinced myself that this was right, that it was about protecting women or maintaining standards. But the truth is, I was just afraid of change. Afraid of admitting that the world I knew was evolving into something I didn't fully understand. And now? Sarah asked. Now I'm an old man approaching retirement. I look at officers like you and realize the military is in better hands than it ever was in mine. You're what a leader should be, Mitchell. What I should have been, but wasn't always. Sarah absorbed his words, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Part of her wanted to accept his apology graciously and move on. But another part, the part that still carried the scars of that young recruit who had endured his mockery, needed to speak. With respect, sir, do you know what it's like to work twice as hard for half the recognition? Sarah asked, her voice calm but firm. To constantly question yourself because someone in authority told you that you didn't belong? To carry the weight of representing all women in the military because people were just waiting for you to fail so they could say, "See, I told you so"? Henderson's face paled. No, I don't. I can't imagine. I carried your words with me for years, Sarah continued. Every obstacle felt harder because I heard your voice in my head telling me I wasn't good enough, that I should quit. It took me a very long time to realize that your opinion said more about you than it ever did about me. You're right, Henderson said quietly. And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't undo the damage I caused, but I am genuinely sorry. Sarah studied him for a long moment. She could see that his apology was sincere, that it came from real reflection and regret. She had dreamed of this moment in various forms over the years, sometimes imagining herself triumphantly rejecting his apology, other times imagining a dramatic confrontation. But now that it was here, she felt something unexpected, compassion. I appreciate your apology, Colonel, Sarah said finally, and I accept it. Not because it erases what happened, but because holding on to anger for 15 years hasn't served me well. You were my Colonel Henderson, but I've realized you were also your own Colonel Henderson, trapped by your own limitations. Henderson looked surprised, then thoughtful. That's very gracious of you. It's not grace, sir. It's self-preservation. I learned a long time ago that I can't control how others see me or treat me. I can only control who I choose to be and how I respond. You tried to break me, but instead you made me more determined. In a strange way, I should thank you for that, though I don't recommend your teaching methods to anyone. A ghost of a smile crossed Henderson's face, the first genuine expression she had seen from him since their reunion. Fair enough. For what it's worth, I hope we can work together professionally during my remaining time here. Of course, sir. We're both officers with a job to do. Henderson stood to leave, then paused at the door. Mitchell, may I ask you something? How did you do it? How did you push through when everything seemed designed to make you quit? Sarah considered the question. I remembered why I joined. Not to prove anything to you or anyone else, but because I believed in serving something larger than myself. When you focus on the mission instead of the critics, the path becomes clearer. Henderson nodded slowly, absorbing her words. The military is lucky to have you. I'm only sorry it took me so long to see it. After he left, Sarah sat alone in her office, processing the conversation. She felt lighter somehow, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. Colonel Henderson's apology didn't change the past, but it did change how she felt about it. The next day at a staff meeting, something shifted. When Sarah presented her recommendations, Colonel Henderson listened attentively and actually contributed constructive suggestions. When a junior officer questioned one of Sarah's decisions, Henderson backed her up with calm authority. The change didn't go unnoticed by others. General Thompson mentioned it privately to Sarah. Whatever conversation you had with Colonel Henderson seems to have been productive. He's been different this past week, more collaborative. I think he's doing some reflecting as he approaches retirement. Sarah replied diplomatically. Well, whatever the reason, it's an improvement. And Mitchell, I want you to know that your performance has been outstanding. The brigade is better for having you here. Sarah's relationship with Colonel Henderson remained professional, but gradually became more comfortable. They would discuss strategy in meetings, sometimes debate the best approach to training challenges, occasionally share a brief conversation about Army life. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was mutual respect, which was more than Sarah had ever expected. 3 months after their private conversation, Fort Harrison faced an unexpected crisis. A massive storm system moved through the region, bringing torrential rain that caused severe flooding throughout the area. The nearby town of Riverside, home to many military families, was hit particularly hard. Within hours, rising waters forced evacuations and cut off entire neighborhoods. General Thompson called an emergency staff meeting at 600 hours. Sarah arrived to find the command center already buzzing with activity. Maps displayed on screens showed the extent of the flooding, with red zones indicating areas of greatest danger. Listen up, General Thompson said as her staff assembled. The governor has requested military assistance. Riverside is underwater, and civilian emergency services are overwhelmed. We're deploying immediately to assist with search and rescue, evacuation, and emergency shelter operations. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, you'll coordinate the ground operations. Sarah felt every eye in the room turn to her. This was a massive responsibility, coordinating hundreds of soldiers across a chaotic disaster zone. But she had trained for moments like this her entire career. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. I'll need access to all available transport vehicles, medical personnel, and search and rescue teams. You have whatever you need, the general confirmed. Colonel Henderson, you'll work with Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell as senior advisor. Your experience with disaster relief operations will be valuable. Sarah and Henderson exchanged a brief glance. If he had any reservations about working under her direction, his expression didn't show it. He simply nodded. Understood, General? Within the hour, the brigade mobilized. Sarah stood in the operations center, coordinating multiple teams simultaneously. On one screen, she tracked vehicle positions. On another, she monitored weather updates. Radio chatter filled the air as unit leaders reported their status. 2nd Battalion reports Route 17 is impassable due to flooding, the lieutenant called out. Sarah moved to the map, studying alternative routes. Redirect them through the industrial park on the north side. It's higher ground. Colonel Henderson, can you verify the bridge capacity on Maple Street? Henderson was already pulling up the information. Bridge is rated for 30 tons, should handle our vehicles. But it's the only way into the southern sector now, and we make it work, Sarah decided. Tell 2nd Battalion to proceed carefully and establish a relay point on the far side. As the operation progressed, the magnitude of the disaster became clear. Hundreds of residents were trapped in their homes by rising water. An elderly care facility was in danger of losing power. An elementary school sheltering families was running out of supplies. Sarah made rapid decisions, prioritizing the most urgent situations while keeping track of resource allocation. She sent one team to the care facility with generators and medical supplies. Another team began evacuating the most vulnerable residents by boat and high-clearance vehicles. A third team established a supply distribution point at the school. Colonel Henderson worked beside her, managing communications and providing suggestions when asked. Sarah noticed that he deferred to her decisions without question, even when he might have done things differently. At one point, when a captain seemed hesitant to follow one of Sarah's orders, Henderson stepped in. You heard the lieutenant colonel? Get your team moving now. People are counting on us. The captain saluted and hurried off. Henderson turned to Sarah. You're doing excellent work. Your crisis management instincts are spot on. Sarah barely had time to acknowledge the compliment before another urgent situation demanded her attention. A rescue team reported finding a family trapped on their roof, including 2 small children and an infant. But the water current was too strong for a safe boat approach. I need a helicopter for evacuation, Sarah said into her radio. Grid coordinates 847 to 295. Family of 5 on a rooftop, including an infant. Negative, ma'am, came the response. All helicopters are grounded due to high winds. Weather service says it won't be safe to fly for at least 2 more hours. Sarah's mind raced through options. 2 hours was too long. The house was already showing signs of structural stress from the water pressure. She looked at the map, calculating distances and water depths. Team 6, what's your current position? She asked. 3 blocks east of the target location, ma'am. We have high clearance rescue vehicles. Can you reach them by vehicle? There was a pause. It would be risky, ma'am. Water's deep and current is strong. But it's possible if we go slow and steady. Sarah knew she was asking them to take a risk. But she also knew that family couldn't wait 2 hours. Do it. But proceed with extreme caution. Henderson, get me a structural engineer on the line. I want to know how long that house will hold. The next 30 minutes were tense. Sarah monitored Team 6's progress while simultaneously managing a dozen other ongoing operations. The radio crackled with updates as the rescue team inched through the floodwaters toward the stranded family. Colonel Henderson stood beside her, watching the screens intently. You made the right call, he said quietly. Waiting wasn't an option. Finally, the radio crackled with good news. Team 6 to command. We have the family. All 5 members safe and headed to the medical checkpoint. Relief washed through the operations center. Sarah allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, then returned to the numerous other situations requiring her attention. The operation continued through the night and into the next day. Sarah barely slept, catching 20-minute naps when absolutely necessary before returning to coordinate the ongoing efforts. Colonel Henderson matched her dedication, remaining at his post to support her decisions and help manage the complex operation. By the second evening, the worst was over. The rain had stopped, water levels were receding, and all residents in immediate danger had been evacuated. The brigade had rescued over 300 civilians, provided medical care to dozens, and established emergency shelters for hundreds more. Sarah stood outside the command center, finally allowing herself a moment to rest. She was exhausted, her uniform wrinkled, and her eyes burning from lack of sleep, but they had succeeded. No lives were lost. The military response had been praised by local officials. Colonel Henderson emerged from the building and stood beside her, looking equally tired. Hell of a job you did, Mitchell. That was some of the finest leadership I've witnessed in my entire career. Sarah turned to look at him, surprised by the emotion in his voice. Thank you, sir. But it was a team effort. Everyone played their part. Don't diminish what you did, Henderson said firmly. You made dozens of critical decisions under pressure, managed multiple crises simultaneously, and brought everyone home safe. That family with the infant, they're alive because you didn't hesitate. That's leadership. Before Sarah could respond, General Thompson appeared with several other senior officers. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell, outstanding work. The governor's office called personally to express their gratitude. You should be proud of what you accomplished here. Thank you, ma'am. The soldiers deserve the credit. They executed flawlessly under difficult conditions. They executed your orders, the general corrected. Good soldiers need good leaders, and you proved yourself to be exactly that. The following week, as the brigade returned to normal operations, Sarah found herself unexpectedly called to the general's office. When she entered, she found not only General Thompson, but also a 2-star general she didn't recognize, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. This is Major General Patricia Reynolds from Division Headquarters, General Thompson introduced. Sarah saluted smartly. Ma'am? At ease, General Reynolds said with a warm smile. I wanted to meet you in person after reviewing your performance during the flooding crisis. Your leadership was exemplary. I'm here because we have an opportunity that might interest you. Sarah listened as General Reynolds explained that a colonel position had opened up at Division Headquarters. Overseeing training and readiness for multiple brigades, it was a significant promotion and a highly competitive position. Based on her record and recent performance, Sarah was being offered the assignment. You'd be promoted to full colonel, General Reynolds explained. The youngest in the division. It's a challenging role, but I believe you're ready for it. Sarah felt her heart race. Colonel, the same rank that Henderson had held when he was tormenting her during basic training. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I'm honored, ma'am. I accept." "Excellent. Your promotion ceremony will be in 2 weeks. Congratulations, Colonel Mitchell." News of Sarah's promotion spread quickly through the brigade. Fellow officers congratulated her. Soldiers under her command expressed pride. And even people she barely knew sent messages of support. The formal promotion ceremony would be a significant event, attended by senior leadership from across the division. Colonel Henderson approached her in the hallway the day after the announcement. "Congratulations on your promotion. It's well-deserved." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." Henderson hesitated, then spoke carefully. "I wonder if I might ask you something. Would it be appropriate for me to attend your promotion ceremony? I understand if you'd prefer I didn't." Sarah considered the question. 2 weeks ago she might have said no. But something had changed during the crisis. Working alongside Henderson, seeing his genuine respect for her abilities and his sincere efforts to support her, had shifted her perspective. "I would be honored to have you there, sir," she said honestly. The day of the promotion ceremony arrived with perfect weather. The event was held outdoors on the parade grounds, with hundreds of soldiers in formation and senior officers seated in the front rows. Sarah's family had flown in for the occasion, including her aging father, who beamed with pride despite his declining health. Sarah stood at attention as General Reynolds read the promotion orders. The words washed over her, official and formal, but their meaning was profound. She was about to become a colonel, achieving a rank that only a tiny percentage of officers ever reached. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, having demonstrated exceptional leadership, strategic acumen, and unwavering dedication to duty, is hereby promoted to the rank of colonel in the United States Army. General Reynolds removed the lieutenant colonel insignia from Sarah's uniform and replaced them with the silver eagle insignia of a full colonel. The assembled soldiers erupted in applause. Sarah's mother was crying, and her father saluted her from his seat, his hand shaking slightly, but his pride evident. After the ceremony, a reception was held where officers and guests could congratulate the newly promoted colonel. Sarah moved through the crowd, thanking people and accepting their well wishes. She noticed Colonel Henderson standing somewhat apart from the main group, watching the celebration with a thoughtful expression. Sarah excused herself from a conversation and walked over to him. "Thank you for coming, Colonel Henderson." "I wouldn't have missed it," he replied. "You've earned every bit of this, Mitchell. Colonel Mitchell, I should say." Sarah smiled slightly. "It feels strange hearing that rank attached to my name. You'll grow into it quickly. You were born for this level of leadership." Henderson paused, seeming to struggle with something. "I need you to know something. Watching your ceremony today, seeing you promoted to the rank I held, it made me reflect on my own career. And I realized that you've already accomplished more of genuine value than I did in all my years of service." "That's not true, sir. You served honorably for over 3 decades. "I served, yes. But I let prejudice and fear limit my effectiveness. I tried to push away talented people like you instead of mentoring them. I enforced outdated beliefs instead of adapting to a changing world. You, on the other hand, have led with integrity from the beginning. You've made the military better by your presence in it." Sarah was moved by his words, but also felt the need to be honest. "You're being too hard on yourself, Colonel. People can change and grow. You've shown me that these past few months. The fact that you can acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them, that takes courage too." Henderson smiled sadly. "Kind words from someone who had every reason to tell me to go to hell. Anger is exhausting," Sarah said simply, "and ultimately pointless. I'd rather focus on moving forward." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the celebration continue around them. Then Henderson straightened and came to attention. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hand in a crisp salute. Sarah understood immediately what he was doing. This wasn't just a salute between 2 officers. This was Henderson acknowledging everything that had passed between them, apologizing in the formal language of military tradition, and showing respect not just for her rank, but for her as a person and leader. Sarah returned the salute, holding it for a long moment before both officers dropped their hands. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said quietly. "No, Colonel Mitchell. Thank you." for being the leader I should have been, for showing me what real strength looks like, and for having the grace to forgive an old fool who didn't know any better." As Henderson walked away, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure. She had spent so many years carrying the weight of his disapproval, trying to prove him wrong, fighting against the echo of his mockery. But now, standing here as a newly promoted colonel, she realized she had nothing left to prove. She had succeeded not because of Colonel Henderson or in spite of him, but because of her own merit, determination, and character. His opinion, whether negative or positive, had never truly defined her. She had defined herself through her actions, her choices, and her unwavering commitment to being the best officer she could be. Sarah rejoined the celebration, accepting more congratulations and posing for photos with her family. But in the back of her mind, she was already thinking about her new assignment. The challenges ahead and the soldiers she would lead. The past was finally at peace. The future was waiting, full of possibility and purpose. And somewhere in that future, Colonel Sarah Mitchell would continue to prove that leadership, courage, and excellence had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. Colonel Sarah Mitchell settled into her new role at Division headquarters with the same dedication she had brought to every assignment in her career. Her office overlooked the training grounds. She often stood at the window watching new recruits go through the same exercises she had endured 2 decades earlier. The sight always brought a mixture of nostalgia and determination. Her responsibilities were vast. She oversaw training programs for 5 brigades, ensuring soldiers were prepared for modern combat challenges. She developed new tactical doctrines that incorporated lessons learned from recent conflicts. She evaluated officer performance and made recommendations for promotions and assignments. It was demanding work, but Sarah thrived on the challenge. One morning, about 6 months into her new position, Sarah received a memo from the division commander. The military was launching a new mentorship program pairing senior officers, approaching retirement with mid-level officers to transfer knowledge and experience. As one of the youngest colonels in the division, Sarah was asked to participate. What surprised her was the name of the officer she was assigned to mentor. Colonel Marcus Henderson. Sarah stared at the memo for a long moment. Henderson had extended his retirement date by a year to participate in a special advisory role, and he had specifically requested to work with her. The memo included a personal note from him, explaining that he wanted to spend his final year in service learning from the new generation of leaders before he left the military. Sarah scheduled a meeting with Henderson for the following week. When he arrived at her office, she noticed he looked older than during their time at Fort Harrison. Retirement was approaching fast, and it showed in the slight stoop of his shoulders and the weariness in his eyes. "Colonel Henderson, please sit," Sarah said, gesturing to a chair. "I was surprised to see your name on the mentorship assignment." "I imagine you were," Henderson replied, settling into the chair. "And I want to make something clear from the start. This isn't some symbolic gesture or public relations move. I genuinely want to learn from you. I have 1 year left in uniform, and I want to leave the military better than I found it. I think working with you can help me do that." Sarah studied him carefully. "What exactly are you hoping to learn?" "How to be a better leader," Henderson said simply. "How to adapt to change instead of resisting it. How to recognize talent in all forms instead of looking for it in only familiar packages. You've mastered these things, and I never did. I want to understand how." Over the following months, Sarah and Henderson met regularly. Their sessions weren't traditional mentorship meetings where the senior officer dispensed wisdom. Instead, they were conversations where Henderson asked questions and Sarah shared her philosophy of leadership. "When you face a difficult decision, how do you approach it?" Henderson asked during one session. "I gather all available information, consult with people who have relevant expertise, and then I consider what outcome serves the mission and the people under my command," Sarah explained. "But I also trust my instincts. Experience teaches you to recognize patterns, even in new situations, and when you make a mistake, I acknowledge it, learn from it, and move forward. I've made plenty of mistakes in my career. The key is not letting fear of mistakes prevent you from making decisions at all." Henderson took notes during their conversations, asking follow-up questions and really listening to her responses. Sarah found herself enjoying these sessions more than she had expected. There was something satisfying about helping someone genuinely trying to grow, even this late in his career. One day, Henderson brought up a sensitive topic. "I've been thinking about all the soldiers I may have pushed away or discouraged during my career. Women, minorities, anyone who didn't fit my narrow definition of what a soldier should be. How do I make up for that damage?" Sarah considered the question carefully. You can't undo the past, but you can influence the future. Use your remaining time to advocate for change. When you hear other officers expressing the same prejudices you once held, challenge them. Share what you've learned. Be honest about your own failures, so others might avoid making the same mistakes. Like a cautionary tale, Henderson said with a bitter smile. Like a success story, Sarah corrected. The ability to recognize your mistakes and change is a strength, not a weakness. Many officers never achieve that level of self-awareness. Henderson began implementing Sarah's suggestion. During staff meetings, when discussions turned to recruiting or promotion policies, he spoke up in ways that surprised his peers. He advocated for expanding opportunities for women in combat roles. He challenged assumptions about who could succeed in leadership positions. He shared his own story of misguided beliefs and how changing his perspective had made him a better officer. Some of his fellow senior officers were skeptical of his transformation. During one particularly tense meeting, a colonel made dismissive comments about female soldiers in infantry units. Henderson responded with uncharacteristic passion. "I thought exactly like you once," Henderson said. "I was convinced women couldn't handle combat stress or make tough battlefield decisions. Then I served alongside Colonel Mitchell during a crisis situation. I watched her coordinate a complex rescue operation under extreme pressure, making life-and-death decisions while managing hundreds of soldiers. She outperformed most male officers I've served with in my entire career. My beliefs weren't based on facts. They were based on fear and habit." The room fell silent. The other colonel looked uncomfortable but didn't respond. After the meeting, several younger officers approached Henderson, privately to thank him for speaking up. Sarah heard about the incident through the military grapevine. When Henderson came to their next mentorship session, she addressed it directly. "I heard you made quite an impression at the infrastructure meeting," she said. Henderson looked embarrassed. "I may have been more forceful than necessary." "Kay, on the contrary, I think you were exactly as forceful as necessary. Change doesn't happen through polite hints. It requires people willing to speak uncomfortable truths." "I spent 35 years on the wrong side of those truths," Henderson said quietly. "The least I can do now is spend my last year on the right side." As their mentorship continued, Sarah found herself learning from Henderson as well, though in unexpected ways. His decades of experience provided historical context for current challenges. He remembered policy changes that had failed and could explain why. He knew the political dynamics within the senior leadership that Sarah was only beginning to navigate. "You're going to continue rising through the ranks," Henderson told her during one session. "Probably to general officer if you want it. But the higher you go, the more you'll deal with politics and bureaucracy. Don't let it change who you are. Don't let it make you cynical." "Did it make you cynical?" Sarah asked. Henderson thought for a moment. "Yes, I think it did. I became so focused on following established rules and maintaining tradition that I forgot why those things existed in the first place. The military exists to defend the nation. We do that best when we have the finest people serving, regardless of who they are or where they come from. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that basic truth." Another dimension emerged in their relationship when Henderson asked Sarah to observe him during a training inspection. He wanted her feedback on his leadership style and suggestions for improvement. Sarah agreed, though she found the request somewhat unusual. She watched as Henderson inspected a company of new recruits. His approach was firm but fair, nothing like the harsh, demeaning style he had used on her 2 decades earlier. He corrected mistakes without humiliating soldiers. He asked questions to understand their perspectives. When he encountered a struggling recruit, he offered encouragement rather than mockery. After the inspection, Henderson asked for Sarah's assessment. She was honest, but kind. "You've changed dramatically from the officer I encountered in basic training. You're actually quite good at this now. The soldiers respect you, And more importantly, they trust you. What? Henderson prompted, sensing there was more. But I still see you holding back sometimes, especially with female recruits. You're trying so hard not to be discriminatory that you're almost overly careful. Treat them exactly like you'd treat anyone else. They don't need special consideration. They need the same standards, the same challenges, and the same opportunities to prove themselves. Henderson nodded slowly. You're right. I'm overcompensating. Old habits die hard. Keep working at it. You're making progress. Their mentorship relationship evolved into something approaching genuine friendship. They began having occasional lunches together, talking about topics beyond military leadership. Henderson shared stories about his family, his grandchildren, his plans for retirement. Sarah talked about her own hopes for the future, challenges of balancing career and personal life, her thoughts about where the military was headed. One afternoon, Henderson asked Sarah a question that had clearly been on his mind for some time. Do you ever wonder what your career might have been like if you'd had supportive leadership from the beginning? If someone had mentored you instead of trying to break you? Sarah had considered this question before. Sometimes, she admitted. But honestly, I think I needed to fight for everything I achieved. It taught me resilience. It showed me that my success couldn't be dismissed as favoritism or special treatment. Every accomplishment was earned through merit alone. That's a generous way to look at it, Henderson said. I robbed you of what should have been a positive start to your career, maybe, Sarah acknowledged. But you also inadvertently taught me valuable lessons. You showed me what bad leadership looks like, which helped me understand what good leadership should be. You demonstrated how prejudice limits not just its victims, but also the people who hold those beliefs. In a strange way, you made me a better officer by being such a terrible example. Henderson laughed, though the sound was tinged with sadness. I suppose that's one positive outcome from my failures. Though I would have preferred to teach you through good example rather than serving as a cautionary tale. As Henderson's retirement date approached, Sarah noticed a change in him. He seemed lighter somehow, more at peace. The bitterness and rigid thinking that had characterized him for so long had been replaced by a gentler wisdom. He smiled more often. He listened more carefully. He admitted uncertainty instead of pretending to have all the answers. During one of their final mentorship sessions, Henderson brought Sarah a gift, a worn leather journal that had belonged to his father, also a career military officer. I want you to have this, Henderson said. My father kept notes on every officer he served with, lessons he learned, mistakes he made. I've been reading through it lately and I've realized he struggled with many of the same issues I did. The difference is, he spent his whole career trying to be better. I wasted most of mine being stubborn. Sarah accepted the journal, touched by the gesture. Thank you. I'll treasure this. There's an entry near the end that I think you should read, Henderson said. It's dated about 3 months before he retired. He wrote, I've finally learned the most important lesson of military service. Leadership isn't about being the strongest or the toughest or the most feared. It's about bringing out the best in others and helping them become leaders themselves. I wish I had understood this 40 years ago. That's what you do naturally. Sarah, what took him a lifetime to learn and what I'm only grasping now at the end of my career. You've known from the beginning. The day of Colonel Henderson's retirement ceremony arrived with crystal clear skies and a gentle breeze. The ceremony was scheduled for 1400 hours on the main parade ground, and preparations had been underway since dawn. Flags lined the walkways, chairs were arranged in perfect rows. The small stage had been erected for the official proceedings. Sarah arrived early, wanting to review the final details. As the presiding officer for the ceremony, she had specific responsibilities to ensure everything went smoothly. But this ceremony was more than just another official duty. It represented the closing of a chapter that had spanned 2 decades of her life. Colonel Henderson arrived an hour before the ceremony, his dress uniform immaculate. Sarah met him near the staging area, and they shared a moment of quiet understanding before the crowds arrived. Nervous? Sarah asked. Surprisingly, no, Henderson replied. I thought I would be, but mostly I feel grateful. Grateful for the opportunity to serve, and especially grateful for this past year working with you. It's given me some peace about how my career's ending. Guests began arriving. Henderson's family filled several rows, his wife of 40 years sitting proudly in the front with their children and grandchildren around her. Fellow officers, some who had served with Henderson for decades, took their seats. Even some of the recruits he had trained in recent months attended. Wanting to pay their respects, Sarah noticed several senior officers she hadn't expected to see, including Major General Patricia Williams, the officer who had mentored her years ago during officer candidate school. General Williams caught Sarah's eye and gave her an approving nod at precisely 1400 hours. Sarah called the assembly to attention. The ceremony began with the traditional military precision that Henderson had valued throughout his career. The division band played patriotic music. The color guard presented the flags. Then Sarah stepped to the podium to begin the official proceedings. We gather today to honor Colonel Marcus Henderson as he concludes 36 years of dedicated service to our nation. Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the parade ground. Colonel Henderson has served in multiple theaters of operation, commanded at various levels, and trained thousands of soldiers throughout his career. Sarah recounted Henderson's service record, highlighting his deployments, awards, and significant achievements. But she also spoke about something less tangible. Military service changes us, Sarah continued. It challenges us to grow beyond who we were when we first put on the uniform. Colonel Henderson's career exemplifies this truth. He began his service in a different era of the military, and he has had to adapt as our institution evolved. That willingness to learn and change even late in his career represents the best qualities of an officer and a leader. She saw Henderson's wife dabbing at her eyes. Several other attendees nodded in agreement with Sarah's words. The division commander, Major General Richard Chen, spoke next, offering official recognition of Henderson's service. Then came the presentation of Henderson's retirement certificate and flag, ceremonial elements that marked the transition from active duty to veteran status. Finally, it was time for Henderson's retirement speech. He approached the podium slowly, taking a moment to look out at the assembled crowd. When he began speaking, his voice was strong but emotional. 36 years ago, I raised my right hand and swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. Today I fulfilled that oath one final time as I transition from active duty. But the values that oath represents, duty, honor, country, those will remain with me for the rest of my life. Henderson paused, gathering his thoughts. I've made many mistakes during my career. I've been too rigid when I should have been flexible. I've judged people based on superficial characteristics instead of their capabilities. I've let tradition become an excuse for maintaining outdated beliefs. A murmur went through the crowd. This level of honest self-reflection was unusual in a retirement speech. But in my final year of service, I had the privilege of working with one of the finest officers I've ever encountered, Henderson continued. Looking directly at Sarah, Colonel Mitchell taught me that true strength isn't about never being wrong. It's about having the courage to recognize when you're wrong and the character to change. She taught me that leadership isn't about enforcing your will on others. It's about inspiring them to achieve more than they thought possible. Sarah felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. If I could go back and do things differently, I would, Henderson said, his voice thick. I would be a better mentor to young soldiers. I would judge people by their merit rather than my prejudices. I would embrace change instead of fighting it. But since I can't change the past, I'm grateful for the opportunity to at least end my career on the right path. He turned more fully towards Sarah. Colonel Mitchell, I owe you an apology that I've made privately, but I want to make it publicly as well. Early in your career, I treated you poorly. I tried to discourage you from pursuing your military service. I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. You have become everything I should have been, but often wasn't. You're the future of this military, and it's in better hands because of officers like you. Henderson came to attention and rendered a crisp salute directly to Sarah. The gesture was unusual. The retiring officer saluting a younger officer during his own ceremony, but the symbolism was clear to everyone watching. This wasn't just military protocol. This was a public acknowledgement of respect, admiration, and apology. Sarah returned the salute, holding it as tradition required, but also holding it longer to acknowledge everything that gesture represented. When they both dropped their hands, spontaneous applause broke out among the attendees. The ceremony concluded with traditional elements. Henderson's wife pinned on his retirement insignia. His children presented him with gifts representing his service. The division commander presented Henderson with a shadow box containing his medals and ribbons, a keepsake that would remind him of his years in uniform. As the ceremony ended and attendees moved to the reception area, Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers. Fellow officers congratulated her on presiding over such a meaningful ceremony. Junior officers thanked her for showing what ethical leadership looked like. General Williams pulled her aside for a private word. "That was exceptionally well done, Sarah," the general said. "The way you honored Henderson's service while acknowledging growth and change that took wisdom beyond your years." "He earned it," Sarah replied. "He spent his last year genuinely trying to be better. That deserves recognition." "It does," General Williams agreed. "But you gave him the opportunity to change by treating him with grace when you could have been vindictive. That says a great deal about your character." At the reception, Sarah finally had a chance to speak privately with Henderson and his wife. Mrs. Henderson embraced Sarah warmly. "Thank you for helping my husband find peace," she said softly. "He's been carrying guilt about his past behavior for years. Working with you this past year has changed him. He smiles more now. He sleeps better. He's excited about retirement instead of dreading it. He did the hard work himself," Sarah said. "I just provided a different perspective." Henderson shook Sarah's hand, his grip firm. "I meant every word I said during the ceremony. You're going to go far in this military, Sarah, probably further than I ever did. And you'll do it the right way, by lifting others up rather than tearing them down." "What will you do in retirement?" Sarah asked. "I'm going to spend time with my grandchildren," Henderson said with a smile. "Teach them about service and sacrifice, but also about the importance of keeping an open mind. Maybe volunteer at a veterans organization. And I'm thinking about speaking at military academies about leadership and the importance of adapting to change." "That sounds perfect," Sarah said sincerely. As the reception wound down and guests began departing, Sarah stood alone for a moment on the parade ground where the ceremony had taken place. She thought about her journey. From that terrified recruit standing at attention while Henderson mocked her, to a respected colonel presiding over his retirement, the journey hadn't been easy. She had faced obstacles that male officers never encountered. She had worked twice as hard for recognition that came easily to others. She had carried the weight of representing all women in the military, knowing that her failures would be generalized, while her successes would be seen as exceptions. But she had persevered. More than that, she had thrived. And in the process, she had helped change the institution she loved, making it more inclusive and more just. Lieutenant Maria Santos approached, one of the junior officers Sarah had been mentoring. Maria had been in the audience for Henderson's retirement. "That was incredible, ma'am," Maria said. "The way Colonel Henderson acknowledged his mistakes publicly and the way you handled it with such dignity, it gives me hope." "Hope for what?" Sarah asked. "Hope that the military is truly changing, that women like us don't have to fight every battle our predecessors fought, that we can be judged on our merit." Sarah smiled. "You'll still face challenges, Maria. There are still officers out there like Henderson was 20 years ago. But there are also more officers willing to change, willing to learn, willing to do better. And there are more women like you coming up through the ranks, making it impossible to pretend we don't belong here." "Did you ever imagine things would turn out this way?" Maria asked. "With Colonel Henderson, I mean." Sarah considered the question. "No, honestly, I didn't. I imagined many scenarios over the years, but redemption wasn't one of them. I think that's an important lesson. People are capable of change even when we don't expect it, even when we've given up on them." That evening, Sarah sat in her office reviewing the day's events. On her desk was the leather journal Henderson had given her, his father's notes on leadership and service. She opened it and read the entry he had mentioned about leadership being about bringing out the best in others. She picked up a pen and began writing her own entry on a blank page near the back of the journal. She wrote about her journey from recruit to colonel, about facing discrimination and overcoming it, about the importance of perseverance and integrity, about the unexpected redemption of Colonel Henderson and what it taught her about forgiveness and growth. But mostly she wrote about hope. Hope for the future of the military. Hope for the young officers like Maria Santos who were following in her footsteps. Hope that each generation would face fewer barriers than the one before. A soft knock on her door interrupted her writing. She looked up to see Major General Williams standing in the doorway. "May I come in, Colonel Mitchell?" "Of course, ma'am," Sarah said, standing. General Williams entered and closed the door behind her. "I have news that I wanted to share with you personally before it becomes official. The promotion board has selected you for Brigadier General. If you accept, you'll be one of the youngest female generals in the Army." Sarah felt the words hit her like a physical force. Brigadier General. A star on her shoulder, the culmination of decades of hard work and sacrifice. "I'm honored, ma'am." "I accept. I thought you would," General Williams said with a smile. "Your promotion ceremony will be in 6 months. But I wanted you to know now because your new assignment will require you to relocate. You'll be taking command of a division training center, responsible for preparing the next generation of soldiers. Training the next generation. Sarah thought about the young recruit she had been, standing terrified while Colonel Henderson tried to break her spirit. Now she would have the opportunity to ensure that future recruits had a different experience. To create an environment where talent was recognized regardless of gender or background. To build the kind of military she had always believed in. "That's perfect, ma'am. That's exactly where I want to be." After General Williams left, Sarah sat alone in her office, processing the news. She thought about calling her family to share the announcement, but decided to wait until it was official. Instead, she returned to the journal and added one final thought to her entry. She wrote about coming full circle. About how the colonel who had mocked her for years had ultimately saluted her. About how the institution that had seemed designed to keep her out had instead elevated her to heights she had barely dared to dream about. About how the challenges that had tried to break her had instead forged her into the leader she was meant to be. Sarah closed the journal and stood at her window, looking out at the base where thousands of soldiers trained, worked, and served. Somewhere out there was another young recruit facing doubt and discrimination. Another woman wondering if she belonged in this military. Another person fighting to prove their worth against people who had already decided they didn't measure up. Sarah made a silent promise to that unknown soldier. The path wouldn't be easy, but it would be there. The doors wouldn't always be open, but they would be unlocked. The voices saying you can't would still exist, but they would be drowned out by voices saying you can. And maybe, just maybe, by the time that young recruit became a colonel herself, the battles Sarah had fought would seem like ancient history. Maybe the question wouldn't be whether women belonged in the military, but simply how everyone could serve with excellence and integrity. That was the future worth fighting for. That was the legacy Sarah intended to build. Not just her own success, but a path that others could follow more easily. Not just breaking barriers, but tearing them down so completely that future generations would barely remember they had existed. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her office early, as always. She had meetings scheduled, decisions to make, soldiers to lead. But first, she took a moment to look at a photo on her desk from Henderson's retirement ceremony. In it, she and Henderson stood side by side in their dress uniforms, both colonels, both with pride and respect in their eyes. It was an unlikely friendship, born from conflict and forged through growth. It was a reminder that people were more complex than their worst moments. It was proof that change was possible, even when it seemed impossible. Sarah set the photo back on her desk and turned to her work. She had a military to help lead, a future to help shape, and a promise to keep. The colonel who had mocked her was now retired, but his last year of service had been his finest. And Sarah, the young recruit he had tried to break, was now a colonel, soon to be a general. The ending wasn't revenge. It was something better. It was redemption, growth, and hope. It was the story of two people who had both become better than they had been. And it was proof that the long arc of justice, while slow, does eventually bend toward what is right. Sarah smiled and got to work. There were soldiers to train, leaders to develop, and a future to build. And she was exactly where she was meant to be,